media, strangest of subject in the strangest of times, reporting of sexual offences, the legal and ethical aspects of reporting court cases, some of the detail of which can be disturbing. But there we have the most disturbing one of all on the front page there, Jimmy Savile and his well publicised and well known doings by now. Essential that people are brought to justice, essential that we report it properly, and essential that characters like him are exposed. That's the right word. Okay, to start with sexual offences and reporting restrictions. The Sexual Offences Act in 1992 was updated in 2004, gives automatic anonymity for life to victims of most sexual offences in the UK, which means that reporters cannot identify the victim of a sexual offence at any point unless they give written permission and they are 16 years of age. We'll look into that detail a bit more later. We don't report victims of sexual offences. When it happens, people get in trouble. Again, we'll look at some of that later on and see some more detail on that. This automatic anonymity for to victims of sexual offences begins immediately from when the allegation is made. Even if the allegation is later withdrawn, that anonymity remains. Even if the police were told or not, the anonymity has to remain. When the police are told, of course, it stays then. Whether or not the alleged perpetrator is prosecuted or not, if it's not found to be an actual offence, the anonymity of the victim or supposed victim still remains. If there's a prosecution, whether that person who's prosecuted for the sexual offence is convicted or found innocent, the anonymity remains. Strict law throughout all proceedings that the anonymity of a victim of a sexual offence is maintained throughout. And that ban covers the name, address, the place of education or where they work, any picture that might lead to identification, the danger of a jigsaw identification, which we'll look at again in more detail, which is the gradual building up of the identity of a person through one or more representation in the media, whether it be a half-shot picture or a description of where they live or work, the way the offence is described in different types of media. Again, we'll look at that in detail in a few minutes. The media is responsible for the publication of information that could lead to identification. So, like I say, we'll look at the detail that it needs a bit of explaining. Also, the prosecutions under the Sexual Offences Act can lead to a criminal conviction for anyone so doing that. So if you reveal the name of or identity of anyone in a victim of a sexual offence, you are liable to be punished by the law, and it's a criminal offence. Here's one here. You can imagine the horror of this man, who is the editor of a local newspaper, who left someone to sub-edit and write the headlines and publish a story from a court case. He didn't deal with it that day, and apparently the story was written by a trainee and went through the hands of 5 experienced journalists. None of them spotted that the victim had been identified. This man, the editor of the paper, David Lafferty, was up in front of the judge for breaking the law on this. Although they accepted he didn't know that it was going to happen, they also insisted that the company was fined £1,500 and was ordered to pay £1,500 to the victim for being identified. So his mortification, the Macclesfield Express revealing the identity of the newspaper, didn't save him from getting fined. I think he got off quite light for that one, really. Although, to be fair, I can understand how that might happen in a busy newspaper office when he trusted some other people to do it and they let it slip through. Right, jigsaw identification. That will occur if a member of the public who reads, views or hears the reports of more than one organisation can, by combining the different detail in each, recognise a person who should be anonymous. So you've got 2 publications, 2 websites, 2 newspapers, whatever, giving different detail on the same person, and by adding those 2 descriptions together, a member of the public can identify that person, and both lots of reports are in trouble. That's called jigsaw because it's pieced together from different areas, different pieces to make up the whole. This one here, picture of a woman was used in the Mirror, I believe. Yeah, this one was supposedly battered by a footballer ex-footballer called Marlon King, who I believe played at Sheffield United for a while, but that's nothing to do with it. This was pixelated art. Clearly you can't recognise a face, but it was decided that the coat and scarf were so distinctive that person might be recognised, and that she was. There were other elements of identification in the piece, and added to the coat and scarf, she could be identified. So the Mirror got themselves in trouble there. Look out for that kind of thing. You can easily be tripped up on detail like that. This one again was a care worker who was raped in a churchyard, which sounds particularly horrific, and was. This was another case of jigsaw identification, because the woman, they identified the pub she was in, they identified how old she was, and they identified the fact that she was in there on a Friday night, and it was decided that those pieces put together, someone who was a regular in that pub might be able to identify who that person was. So that jigsaw identification got the Gazette and Herald in a bit of trouble, and that's something to avoid. Slightly different tack. Ched Evans, footballer, former Sheffield United player, was convicted of rape. Some fans in the gallery were incensed that he was convicted. It was a really traumatic occasion, lots of screeching and screaming. He fell on the floor in floods of tears, Evans. Anyway, some of his supporters tweeted the name of the woman. You see the names there further down the list. Tweeted the name of the victim, and each of them were fined £624 for the privilege of doing so. 9 people ordered to pay £625 to the compensation to the woman the Evans victim. The verdict was later overturned and Evans was freed, but that was nothing to do with this. This was them overstepping, and the fact that you didn't know the law and that you didn't know you couldn't tweet that woman's name doesn't protect you from the law. The law is the law, and they broke it and they were nicked. It also applies in civil cases as well. This is a woman who was raped by a lottery winner who didn't know he was a lottery winner, and then later went after him for his money in the court for compensation. She said she wanted to see him penniless, but again, as you can see there, she describes as a teenager. Nothing else, no identification. So even though she's going after him for money, and it's a civil case rather than a criminal case, she could still not be identified. I should have looked at whether she won that or not, but I didn't. Well, we can do that later perhaps. So it also applies in civil proceedings, such as claim for damages following rape, or in an employment tribunal. Same thing occurs when sexual offences are involved. Sexual Offences Act of 1992 applies to female and male victims, and the range of offences was extended in 2004 when the law was amended to include rape, sexual assault and other sexual offences, i.e. trafficking, and child sex offences such as grooming, for example. I'm going a bit quick because my battery's a bit low on the old laptop, so you have to excuse me rushing through. But you get the gist of it, and you'll have the slides to look at later. Both males and females can be victims of rape, but only males can be rapists. Females can be guilty of inciting or aiding rape. The Amanda Spencer trial, that was a huge trial in Sheffield in 2014. She started procuring girls for men when she was about 15, I think, and she went and did it for years. Big case. She was really cocky at the beginning, as you can see from the picture there. She ended up coming back. She went to prison, came back again for a further trial when she looked at least 10 years older and a broken, beaten person. Horrible all round, but she was convicted of procuring young girls for older men, and it was a big case at the time. This is an unusual one, the Leitner murders. Arthur Hutchinson there murdered a Sheffield family after a wedding day out in the countryside, posh house. He broke into the house, killed 3 members of the family and raped the daughter. The judge lifted the anonymity rights of the daughter because the case needed to go ahead. He allowed the Sheffield Star and others to report the name of this girl, and she was later identified when giving evidence, because without it the conviction of the murderer who did a runner and was caught later on. A huge case in Sheffield at the time, which was in triple murder and a rape. Because of the scale and difficulty of the case, the barristers, the public were allowed to know who the victim was because she had to give evidence in the murder trial. For you to be able to publish a sexual offences victim name, you need to get consent in writing from the person involved. Not a verbal consent, oh yeah, you can do it. No, it has to be written down so that you can hand it over in evidence if you need it later. The person must be over 16, and the phrase is, the consent is not valid if proved by anyone that you interfered unreasonably with the peace and comfort of that person, as in you pestered or harassed them for that interview or for that anonymity to be lifted, and it was proved that you pushed them into it, badgered them into it, then the consent is not valid and you're guilty of contempt. So there were some terrible and compelling stories that came out of the Rotherham sex offences over the last few years, of the girls in care, etc. And some of those gave anonymity. Some of those waived their anonymity to tell their story. Others told their story anonymously, but that was a huge part of the public understanding the scale and depravity of what happened in those cases. So it's important sometimes, if you can get the consent, to do that as a journalist. Obviously the person needs to want to do that. Some people want to help others to avoid the mistakes, as this one here, although she stayed anonymous, but she spoke out about her ordeal as part of the Rotherham sex scandal. That's one case that was that she was able to make a point without revealing a name. But sometimes others have come forward and told the people who they are and gone full out with it. Other aspects of jigsaw identification, there can be danger of jigsaw identification in incest cases. The Editor's Code advises on this and always advises to identify the defendant if possible. But of course, if you identify the defendant, you cannot describe the case as incest because that identifies the person that it happened to, because incest is a specific offence involving members of the same family. So if you state the defendant's identity, you cannot state the relationship or use the word incest. If you don't use the identity, you can talk about the relationship, which happens sometimes because the identity is not released. But the Editor's Code suggests that we should identify the defendant because that's the person who needs to face the full force of the law and public disapproval of what they've done. So in that case, you cannot say the word incest or indicate what the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim might be. That could lead to jigsaw identification. The Editor's Code Clause 7, children in sex cases. The Editor's Code says, journalists must not identify under 16s who are victims or witnesses, even if legally free to do so. The word incest must not be used where there is a family relationship between the accused and victim. Nothing in the report must reveal the relationship. So it's quite clear. You don't reveal a relationship. You double check to make sure that you haven't. And also, you also need to check what other publications or broadcasters have done to make sure that they've not identified some aspects and done it in a different way, and then that combined with your story, that person might be identified. You need to keep an eye on that. Even different reports from a court case on different days, done by different reporters, jigsaw identification occur that way, unless you have a clear policy of which aspect of the story you are covering. That's why the Editor's Code says you should stick to naming the defendant and let the other stuff remain part of the case and not publicly outed. Editor's Code Clause 11, victims of sexual assault. The press must not identify victims of a sexual assault or publish material likely to contribute to such identification unless there is adequate justification and they are legally free to do so. So that clause means that tells you that unless the judge says that you're free to do so, unless there are other reasons why, such as in the Leitner case, then no one is allowed to identify a victim of sexual assault or contribute to such identification. What about the defendants? What about the person accused of rape who didn't do it? Well, I'm afraid since 1988, I believe, that person has to be identified, and there's quite a lobby to protect people who are falsely accused, but at the moment they are named and they are part of the case. There's no anonymity for defendants in 6 cases. So beware domestic rape cases. Courts have no power to ban the defendant's identity in these cases. It's up to the paper to ensure nothing is published which may identify the victim. So obviously if you name the man, you can't say the relationship. Again, back to where we were. It's also always worth checking with McNays on what the updates may be on this. Here we see, we're on to false allegations. Where someone has made a false allegation of sexual offence, police may prosecute for perjury or perverting the course of justice. He or she can then be identified in a report of court proceedings. So, as we said at the beginning, even if the allegations aren't proven, that the victim must remain anonymous. But if it's proved in a separate case that the supposed victim was lying or was perjuring themselves, then that person can be identified in a report of those proceedings, so the victim is identified then, but only as part of a case against that person because they have misled the court and perverted the course of justice or committed perjury. So, fairly straightforward, I hope. There used to be, as I said before, there is currently no anonymity for rape defendants. The anonymity was made law in 1976 for this very reason, but then again it was repealed in 1988. Police said that anonymity hampers investigations and prevents appeals for victims of serial rapists to come forward. Now, in recent years, we've seen quite a few, like the Me Too movement, even, which is not always about a specific person, but the ability for the willingness of people to come forward when someone else has spoken out is a big part of getting sexual offences perpetrators to justice. So until Jimmy Savile was named in court after he died, unfortunately, many victims had told no one. Others have been punished for speaking out. Others have been not believed. Others had told their story and been ignored and carried it around with them. Some terrible, terrible deeds there, as we know. Same was true in Rochdale, where it was a similar situation to Rotherham with the sexual offences there. Carlisle, Reading, Oxford, Rotherham, of course. But when people came forward and spoke, or when someone was named, then it brought forward other people. And although for a man to be falsely accused of rape, or for anyone to be falsely accused of rape, it's only men, it's a terrible thing, and something that stays with them for a long time or forever. It's thought that that injustice is mitigated and overcome by the injustice meted out to women who are unable to come forward unless someone is named, unless that person becomes part of a case, then they can come forward and talk about their own case. The balance of the law decided that the man should be named as a defendant. Now, I've gone a bit quick on that, but you get the idea. I think there's some extra reading there. McNays, Law to Journalists, an excellent book, which also has all the definitions, lots of case studies, nicely written, easy to understand, step by step. Each stage has questions and answers, a little quiz at the end of each one. It's just an excellent book, and it's well worth having one. Get an up-to-date one. If you get one on eBay, make sure you got the latest one, because there are lots of editions and the law does change. So make sure you get an up-to-date one. And if you have any questions, send an email, or that's it really. That's sexual offences. Any other problems, get in touch and we'll help. Thank you. Bye.